That's not no.
Super easy.
Mine is either I don't need it for the computer, but I need it for something but I play piano or
Matt.
well, you yeah.
We apologize.
Yeah, it would take us
Well, in that middle
I've been
not
here
far.
for
It
years.
takes an hour.
Yeah, I make my way around.
Train.
Actually stepped in and talked with Professor Fritz a little bit last
Yeah,
year.
it's all relative. So that's nice.
I started out in architecture concentration, but I had a real interest in digital kind of organization stuff too, so I kind of jumped back to generalist.
You know how rude it is to ask way to women?
Yep. I took that last semester.
Doesn't.
Now I'm just kind of looking to see what I can, what sort of courses I can do kind of in general applications, like Professor Kipp's metadata, cataloging, reference.
Sounds like you're almost up to dial concentration.
Yeah, kicked it around a little bit to see.
I didn't realize my eyesight was going.
Yeah, it's something kind of seen what's offered. Like the courses compared to last semester. So.
And I couldn't see what was over the cookies.
Somebody told me indexing was a pretty good course, but it wasn't offered this semester.
Everything was this wonderful impressionist.
Thank you all for coming. This is the first meeting of in the academic year 2010 to 2011. I can think in English with numbers very fast. For the Information Organization Research Group, if you don't, you're not familiar with our group, you can get on the school's website and find us. And there is a brief description about the group. We are a bunch of researchers, and we try to recruit students too into this group. So we will do research related to issues in the area of information organization. And we have 5 core members: Dean Olson, and Steve, me, Margaret, and Richard. I don't know how many of you know Richard. Richard is a business professor, and he lives out in Philadelphia. He comes in from time to time. He's a very well-known researcher in I/O. And we have a few PhD students. I'm hoping that Gigi is officially in this group now, and a few others. And master students are welcome. Last year we tried to have 1 meeting per month, but I think it was a little bit too much. So this year we decided to do 2 per semester. So this is our first one, and we are planning for the second one later in the semester. And in addition to this series of meetings that we meet casually, we'll have some less formal presentations. Margaret's going to do one today. And we also plan for much bigger events. And sometimes they don't always fall under the just the exclusive umbrella of information organization. They may be school-wide events like, help me out with the name, Dr.
Which one?
Hurlier. He's coming on November
I think it's the 19th.
19th, but he will talk on the 19th, but he will be here for a few days. And he's also very well known, a very theoretical researcher. And so he will be giving a talk. This event, I think, is sponsored by both our school and the library science school at Madison. So
Inaugural Wisconsin Distinguished Lecture in Library and Information Studies.
oh, you can remember that. Okay, and then we have
And I
another
write that.
international visitor who will come earlier in November too, and he will give a talk, probably a talk at the Student Research Symposium. They changed the name. Okay, and we will also have a postdoc in information organization who will be joining us next semester for 1 year. So for each semester he's here, he will be giving us a talk as well. And we have another lecture series, and we invite one speaker per semester here from other places, you know, and some of them may be international. So we have lots of activities planned for this group, and so you are all welcome to join the group and make this a strong component of the school. So today I'm going to let Margaret talk about tagging.
Yeah. I have done research in other areas, but this was my thesis. So, okay. So the title of my talk is Tagging 6 Years Later. Examining the dynamic relationship between tags and documents. And the reason I called it 6 years later is because the first of the tagging sites really got started in 2004. So it's now been about 6 years, and it's still going strong. So now at least at conferences I no longer have to answer the question, so do you think this is going to be gone in 6 months? Okay. So one of the things I was really interested in when I first started looking at tagging was what was actually going on here. You know, because you look at it, and most of the sites were advertised as social bookmarking sites, right? So the idea was that you would find something interesting on the web, you would bookmark it, and then, you know, it would be out there in plain sight for everybody to see. But then you start to note these patterns as more and more people bookmark popular sites. And you'd notice that the frequency of the popular terms would look like this. So that's kind of a power law, basically. And you're getting these really popular terms at the top here, and then less popular terms down here. I just have to say here, for those of you who are familiar with the term long tail, this is not the long tail. The long tail isn't on this graph. This is only the top 25 tags. There were, you know, hundreds. So the long tail is actually way over there somewhere on the other side of the building.
So each one appearing only once?
Yeah. Eventually when you get into the long tail, you're talking about things that have only been used once. And when you look at them, you can see that some of them you could probably dismiss as noise or as, you know, not being all that exciting. And some of them actually look really interesting, and they're actually, as you get down further, you actually find other languages, and they're the terms you're finding up here, but they're just not as common because this site in particular was heavily English and still is, right? So as you go further down, you find French, Spanish, you know, Chinese, Korean, all kinds of other languages, but they're just not showing up at the top yet. So what happens is you often get single language websites doing the same thing, and that's where you find these terms up at the top, of course. But then that's kind of a facet of the web itself. And basically, no matter how you you draw these things, you're still getting this pattern where some things are just more popular than others when associated with the site. As you can tell, this isn't the same thing. These are just examples. So a lot of the early research in tagging was looking at, well, there were basically two major strands here. One was coming from computer science, and they were all looking at mathematical modeling, graph theory and things like that. The other strand was coming from library and information science, and they were all looking at whether or not it was indexing, basically. Whether or not it would be interesting to librarians. And the early studies showed that a lot of these terms actually do kind of look like index terms. I mean, when you're talking about an article, that article on the previous page was Shirky's article, Ontology is Overrated. So it kind of makes sense that you'd have terms like ontology and tagging there, since that's what the article was about. If a librarian was actually cataloging this, or an indexer was actually, you know, indexing this thing, they would probably use terms sort of like that too. Maybe not exactly, because they might not be in the controlled vocabulary. Another thing you noticed was that you get these patterns of convergence and divergence over time. So you get some terms that were really, really popular and other terms that were not really popular, and this pretty much carries through across time. There's some variation here and there. So this study actually only examines the patterns over a 4-year period. I have the data for 6 years, but unfortunately some of the most interesting sites, I lost a couple of months here and there because the list has changed their display policy, and now you can't go back far enough. So I haven't really looked at that stuff yet because I'm kind of disenchanted with the idea of losing some of my more interesting sites. So I may just go with this study and, move on and find something else. So unfortunately this is a little small, but this is the actual interface you see when you're saving a bookmark. And it usually picks up the URL and the title, and then you would type in the tags. And these days you also get this recommendation box at the bottom for any site that's already been bookmarked. And it has popular tags, tags you've used before that match popular tags, things like that. There's a certain amount of evidence this may be having some impact on tagging as well, because people can just go down and click on these terms instead of actually typing. It's certainly having an impact on my tagging. I'm sure I'm not the only one. So this is what you get when you actually look at what everybody has done. And let me just, I have a bit of a blow up here so you can get a better look here. This site is the Weather Network site for Montreal. I used this slide at a conference in Montreal, so I figured I would use this as an example, bookmarking the weather, because I wanted to know what it was going to be like while I was there. And as you can see here, even though it's Montreal, which is a majority, well, slightly majority French-speaking city, a lot of these tags are in English until you get down to here. And this, of course, is the French word for weather. And down here, another French term for forecasting. And then this one, which I'm not actually sure, previsão and tiempo, Portuguese? Yeah. So you can see just in this top 25 or so, you're getting down into terms which are not English, which is good, right? I mean, it's not like everybody in the world speaks English.
But only because this is a site for Montreal, because it's a multilingual city, right? You don't know.
That's
Sorry.
That's a good point, a good question. I don't know. You'll notice here actually this, I don't know what language that is.
Chinese.
Yeah, so there's also some Chinese in here. I selected a certain chunk of this. If I selected other chunks, I would have had Chinese showing more prominently. Really, this was actually very heavily bookmarked in alternate languages. But you can also see it wasn't that popular. 48. The popular sites have tags that have been used thousands of times. So obviously nobody's bookmarking the weather permanently on Delicious. Kind of makes sense. I only did it for an example. So what I was interested in with this particular study, from the beginning, was what kind of patterns of user tagging emerged through the analysis of the tags applied to a set of documents, and in this case they're URLs. So what I actually did was I collected 63, it was supposed to be 64, but one of them was a duplicate, URLs, and then I actually went through and analyzed the tags that were being used, statistically and qualitatively, to see what was going on. And then a couple years later I collected again, and I wanted to look at what kind of patterns emerged over time. Because there have been 1 or 2 studies looking at patterns in tagging, but they were all relatively short term, because they were all done in 2006. So they only had 2 years worth of data. So I was curious to see whether this had changed or not. So here's the friendly little graphic. This is what you're dealing with when you're dealing with tagging data. You have what's called a post, which is a user bookmarking an item and assigning some tags. And each URL can have many, many posts attached to it, because multiple people can bookmark the URL. So I wrote my own crawler for this and collected this data 3 times. But as I said, unfortunately the 2010 data collection didn't go as well as I hoped. So although I have a couple of slides with some information from 2010, I haven't really analyzed the data yet. But the 4-year results are interesting. So you can see I'm dealing with a lot of posts, 56,000 in 2006, and 136,000 in 2008. It's an increase of 2.88 times. The really popular URLs were sometimes bookmarked 15 times more often, right? A few were actually bookmarked, had actually lost bookmarks over the years. So what had happened was somebody had gone back and deleted it because it was no longer interesting or relevant. So they were really not popular. When I selected them initially, they were all popular bookmarks. They were all listed on the Delicious Popular feed, and I made a certain effort to make sure I had things that actually had been bookmarked by more than about 20 people, so they would be interesting. And we're dealing with a lot of tags too, 163,000 in 2006 and 430,000 in 2008. So tagging is popular. For reference, Delicious announced a year or two ago that they had about 5 million users. They haven't actually given a figure since then, but I assume it's gone up because the number of posts is continuing to increase. So for this talk, I've just picked 3 sample URLs to actually examine in more detail. One of them is 43 Folders. It's a personal productivity site. It's a blog, basically. It's been tagged very heavily on Delicious. Project Gutenberg, if people have heard of that, public domain ebooks. They've been working on this for a long time, long before Google got started on that kind of thing. And WebMD, which is, of course, health information. So just to situate things, they were all first tagged in 2004 at various times during the year. You can see here a comparison of the number of taggers. That's the number of posts that were available in 2006, 2008, and 2010. So you can see this was very popular between 2006 and 2008. It hasn't been bookmarked quite as much in this period. They've all kind of suffered from that. There are a number of reasons for that. One of them is this site actually changed their URL recently. So of course people aren't bookmarking this old URL anymore. Makes sense. So that's why this has dropped off considerably. It's not because it's actually lost popularity, it's because they actually changed their URL. So that's a problem with doing studies like this. Somebody changes the URL and suddenly nobody's bookmarking it anymore, and you're thinking, why is this? So you go and check, and it turns out, perfectly logical explanation. It's not the same URL anymore. Still the same site, not the same URL. WebMD is still very popular. It was actually the least popular in my original study, which was sort of interesting. Not the least popular URL, but the least popular of these 3. And then it experienced a huge explosion in popularity. You get the same kind of pattern with tags. There's actually a direct and fairly strong correlation between the number of tags applied to a site and the number of users who tagged. And that holds true whether you're only looking at unique tags that nobody else has used, or whether you're looking at all of them. Which means that the more people you have tagging, the more tags you get. Which is actually of interest if you're looking at actually using this for anything. It means you have to get more people tagging in order to get more tags, and therefore more useful information. So again, I have 2006, 2008. You can see the patterns here. Number of tags here, 14,000. Here it's 45,000. So it's gone up considerably. But as I said, the number of people tagging has gone up considerably, so therefore the number of tags has too. And you can see a huge jump here with WebMD from 782 to 13,000. As I said, it gained tremendously in popularity. However, despite all this emphasis on talking about number of tags, you can see the number of unique tags is not really all that high. I mean, out of 14,000, we've only got 1,200. And, that holds true here too. And then you get this interesting phenomenon here, which is things which are not tagged at all. So people have just bookmarked it. And this has been holding relatively consistent, actually. It was about 6% weren't tagged in 2006, and actually 7% weren't tagged in 2008. So it seems to be going up a bit. Here we are. Getting ahead of myself. So the number of unique tags, again, you're actually getting an increase here, 62% to 68%. And this has also increased. The user vocabulary length is actually the number of tags that have been used by a single user for a single post. It's a term that's actually used in information retrieval to talk about query length. I've kind of appropriated it for this, but it fits nicely. So you can see it was 10 in 2006. It's now 20. It was 24 in 2008, but the median, the average value is still 2. So you get people who are putting huge numbers of tags on things, but the average person is still using about 2. In my sample, there are at least 2 people who have used over 100 tags on one item. When I first saw that number, I thought it was a mistake. I just assumed, right, that it was a mistake, but I actually went and looked at the Delicious site. You probably can't see these anymore because they were in 2007, but and there were actually 100 tags there. I actually counted till I got to about 30, and I was only about a third of the way. All I can say is these people probably should be librarians because they're obviously completists or indexers or something, So this is probably not a huge surprise that 9 of the 10 most popular items from 2006 were still in the top 10 in 2008. Probably not a huge surprise. I mean, if they were popular in 2006, why would they not still be popular in 2008? Of course, I might have chosen some things that had dropped in popularity. They just didn't show up on the top 10 list. WebMD was actually a newcomer to the list in 2008. In 2006, it was not there. You might have thought it would be, but it wasn't. I think health information searching has become more popular over the years, basically. So now WebMD is extremely popular. And if I did this for 2010, I might find it even higher on the list. And you saw the same trend in the tags, that health became popular in the top 10 in 2008 as well. This is kind of an ironic joke here. System unfiled is the tag that Delicious assigns when you don't tag something. So when I say system unfiled retains its popularity, I'm saying that people are still not tagging things. Most of these systems actually do this now. It used to be that something that didn't have tags actually didn't have tags, but now they put something like this on. Okay, so I looked at a lot of this statistically and drew some graphs. And it's interesting to look at this. So this is the number of users per month over a 4-year period. And you can see it fluctuates a bit here and there, up and down, up and down. Here's the one for Gutenberg. They had a huge drop-off here. Maybe it wasn't that recent that they changed their URL. They must have had a forwarder for a while. So you can see this huge drop-off here. And when you first look at it, you might think it's because it suddenly stopped being popular. Not true. And here's WebMD. And you can see this pattern starting out unpopular and then becoming quite popular. This was obviously a very good month for this. 2007, 09, 10, okay. October 2007. I don't know what happened that month, but it was very popular. You see these patterns repeating themselves. The previous ones where things start out popular and then drop off are actually a little more common in some ways. But you do see these as well where something starts off just, slowly gaining popularity. It probably matches with trend analysis and stuff like that, if you actually look at that kind of thing.
Margaret, do you think that any of them would be seasonal?
That's possible too, actually. Yeah. Although, I don't think that most of the sites I located or used would suffer from that much seasonal variation, but if I bookmark something like winter sports or something, it might be much more popular in the winter than in the summer. But it's hard to say. And it would kind of depend on whether or not it's a general site or whether it's sort of specific to a specific continent. After all, winter is different in the southern hemisphere. This graph, hopefully you can see the contrast between the blue and the orange. Shows you the total number of tags per month, and then the blue at the bottom here is the number of unique tags. This one actually doesn't fluctuate as much. It's pretty steady all the way. the total number, though, does fluctuate. And like I said, that's strongly correlated to the number of people who actually tag. There's actually a correlation between the number of tags and the number of unique tags as well, because you know the more tags you have, the more unique tags you have. It's just not as strong. So like I said, I mean the basic principle here is if you want to use this, you actually have to encourage people to tag, because then you get more data, and you're more likely to get these power laws and get some actual useful data at the top. You'll notice these look a lot like the graphs from the previous page. As I said, there's a very strong correlation between number of users and number of tags, and that explains why these graphs look the same, because they're not actually the same graphs and they're not based on the same data. But it does make it interesting. When you look at the frequency graphs, you often see the same terms showing up again and again at the top of the frequency graph, which kind of makes sense, you know, for the same thing over time. So this is WebMD, and you have health, reference, medical, medicine, health, system unfiled. I wasn't joking about that. It's really popular. And here we go again. Health, medical, reference, medicine. Does this sound familiar? So a lot of the time you see these terms appearing to stay at the top. Notice this graph stops at 180 here, and then the 2008 version stops at 3,500. And of course, you still see system unfiled. So here's the actual comparison here. And you can see that there's a lot of, I guess you'd call this inter-indexer consistency. So obviously, people still agree that this is about health. You're probably wondering about this. Back in 2006, when I collected my first data, Delicious was still separating these terms. What's the difference? So actually, I had a lot of people originally ask me about this and say, well, you should be normalizing your data, right? So, you know, you should be collapsing these and collapsing these. And I kept saying, well, but the whole point is they're not collapsed and Delicious. So then they actually did collapse the distinction between capital and small letter. And in most cases, that's probably, you know, no big deal, right? But I actually do have an example where that might be a bad thing. As I've been told, in deaf culture, they actually use deaf with a capital D to indicate aspects of culture, whereas the term deaf with a small d actually references medical issues having to deal with hearing loss. And this is actually a real distinction between the two terms. And there are probably some others too, but I mean, in this case, you're probably not losing anything by collapsing these. But it's something we don't think about too much when we're indexing. Are we actually losing anything when we collapse terms? Is there an important distinction that we're getting rid of? Or does it really not matter? You know, are we helping people by clustering these together or not? So I thought there was a lot of really interesting things going on here. Okay, so I actually did a lot of different analysis here. I'm just presenting some examples of places where you see convergence or places where you see divergence, you know, just to get people thinking. So another thing I looked at was actually stability. And as I said, when you look at the graphs themselves, the frequency graphs, you see what appears to be stability at the top. It looks like these terms are staying at the top. It looks like they're staying relatively stable. And in general, when you look at these graphs, you see the top 6 or 7 terms appearing to stay in the same place. But when you actually look at the proportions of each tag as compared to the total number of tags, you get these fluctuations. And I'll show you the graph in just a second. But when I attended ASIS in 2007, this fellow Russell had an interesting poster on tag decay, where he was talking about what happens when a term becomes less popular. And that's possibly what's going on with these fluctuations. You might also be seeing changes in terminology use over time, or you might just be seeing, you know, like I said, changes in popularity of the term. So this is the graph, actually, and you can see it's bouncing up and down a lot. The first people looking at this were actually looking at this section right here. So they had maybe 500, 600 things. And you get a much more interesting picture when you look at more stuff, obviously. You can see it's staying relatively stable. It's maybe a 2 to 3% fluctuation in usage. So my question when I look at this, and I'm still not sure the answer to this is this actually significant? Like, does this matter, this 2 to 3% fluctuation? And I have some graphs that show a larger fluctuation too. So does this matter to us when we're indexing things? Is this going to affect our indexing? This is obviously going to have some effect on search if these are the terms people are using. So let me show you the next graph here. This graph is actually, the axes aren't the same, so you can't compare them directly. But this graph shows some 5% fluctuations even. This one here going up here. So you can see over the course of about 1,000 people, it went up by about 5%. So again, I mean, my question is this significant in terms of usability? And also there's this lovely war between the term books and ebooks, where you see people trying to decide which one to use. This is Project Gutenberg, of course, and you know, they are electronic books, but they're of course based on print books. So it's a good question. I noticed the term free was very popular though, which I thought was interesting. The whole point of the project was to provide free public domain ebooks. But again, that's still my question about this. Is 5% important? Is it something we have to think about? Okay. So stability. So that's divergence. Another thing I looked at was influence in tagging. This would be convergence, where we're looking at people who are using the same terms. So one of the things I asked myself was, how can you tell whether people are being influenced or not by previous taggers? I mean, you can look at that delicious input screen and say, well, obviously they're being influenced. The terms are right there. How can you possibly miss them? Well, okay, you could take that stance, but I wanted to see if there was any actual, statistical evidence that there might be influence going on here. So the first thing I did was I looked at whether there was a correlation between the length of time something had been posted and the user vocabulary length. So there actually is one. It's not that big. But it is significant. But when I thought about it, I thought that doesn't really tell me that much about influence. It just says that the more people tag, the higher the number of tags people use. That doesn't actually tell you whether they're being influenced by the terms people are using. It just tells you they're using more terms. So that doesn't really answer the question. So the next thing I looked at was actually the number of intersections between each user tag list. So each user in their post has from 0 to who knows how many tags, 100 obviously. And I looked at the comparison between that and the other tag lists. So I looked to see whether there was an increasing number of intersections, basically whether people were using an increasing number of tags that had been used before. And most of the graphs showed this small positive correlation. You can't really see it on the graph because it's really, really tiny, 0.002. But this red line is actually going slightly up. And all these spiky things are actually the number of intersections. So the number of times that there was a match between the user tag list and what had come before. So the answer is yes, there's obviously some kind of influence going on, but it's not actually all that big. And it wasn't 100% either. This one actually showed a tiny decrease in influence. So people were actually not using the same terms, slightly more as time went by. But this is even smaller. I mean, we're talking about 0.00007. So it may be some of these things are significant, but at this point, I'm not sure it's really saying anything that exciting. So it was sort of interesting that some of them showed that very small positive influence, and some of them are showing a negative influence. Okay, and the last thing I looked at, not quite the last thing, but the last thing I have in this presentation, was actually inter-indexer consistency. So, I also call it inter-tagger consistency. So inter-tagger consistency is actually, when you look at these two things, how similar are they? So here's an example here. You have one tagger who tagged WebMD with health, medical, medicine, and information, and another tagger who used biology, diet, healthcare, WebMD, medicine, medical, health, information, food. And in order to do inter-index or inter-tagged consistency, what you do is you actually compare these two lists, and you say, well, how close did they come to each other? How many terms did they use in common, basically? And previous studies looking at inter-indexer consistency, especially in catalogs where you look at catalog records and see whether they use the same subject terms, and the answer is not all the time, you're getting somewhere between 4% and 82%. And this varies based on whether or not you're using experts, whether or not you're using a controlled vocabulary or whatever, you know, how much support you give people when they're doing the indexing. So, you know, although I read an interesting study where giving expert indexers too much support can actually lower their inter-indexer consistency. So you give them too much information and then they start to think, well, maybe it's this term, maybe it's this term. So, you know, you're better off using their expertise and just letting them use the normal tools, which don't provide quite that much support. So anywhere from 4% to 82%. Now you can imagine 4% is not really that good.
I think that was for images, wasn't it?
Yeah. And it depends on, yeah, you're right, and it depends on the format of the item too. But some things are easier for people to figure out than others. Now a lot of librarians would be bothered by this 82% too and say, well, why can't we make it higher? But I think perhaps the evidence of the tagging research so far is saying that 82% is actually really, really good. And we shouldn't worry too much about the fact that we're not reaching 100. That's my theory anyway. So there are a bunch of different ways to do this. The most common method is actually using what's called a centroid. And all this really is you make a list of what you think are good indexing terms. And then you compare everything to that. And then you say, how close did they get to this optimum good indexing list? And the other method I use, which is unfortunately at the bottom here, is a pairwise comparison where you actually compare every list to every other list. You're probably guessing this is pretty intensive. The largest one I had with 14 or 15,000 tags actually took 48 hours to complete that, just to generate two numbers. So what I found was I was getting, with the centroid, I was getting somewhere between less than 1%, and yes, this did go as low as 0, to 25% matches. So it's not as good as your expert indexer indexing things they're familiar with, but it's actually not too bad considering we don't know who these people are, we have no idea what their background is, and we don't know that much about whether or not they actually agree on what the site is even about. So 25% isn't bad, especially since what I'm comparing here is everything. Even those long tail terms, which are only used by one person. So that's, of course, dragging this number way, way down. So if I chopped off the long tail, I'd get higher numbers. And when I actually did the pairwise comparison, I got better numbers. It was from 3% to 30%. So I didn't get these 0% comparisons. It's kind of nice, actually. So my advice is to do this, even though it's more intensive computationally. But I just thought this was interesting because when you're looking at this stuff, you're seeing this trend over time where you're seeing what appears to be convergence at the upper level and stability. And you're looking at these graphs and you're thinking, wow, you know, over a 4-year or 6-year period, people are still agreeing that WebMD is about health. You know? So this is good, right? Or about medicine, and you're thinking, well, this is great, you know, so maybe we can use this this information for indexing. But then you look at some of the other methods of you know, comparing this stuff, and you're seeing a lot of fluctuations showing up. And, you know, you're seeing fluctuations based on user interests in their everyday life, emergent terminology, and all kinds of things like that. I don't think this necessarily invalidates the first conclusion, but it is something we have to think about. And again, as I said, a lot of studies have speculated that users might be influenced by other taggers, that they might be actually looking at what people have done before. And as I said, I've seen some small significant correlations, and there may be some influence, but you're still getting a lot of evidence that people are still thinking for themselves and saying, well, I know what this site is about, and I don't care what everybody else said already. Because you're still getting things that aren't tagged, you're still getting lots of terms that are used by only one person, and you're still not getting you know, 100% agreement that WebMD is all about health. You're getting lots of other terms too. So I'd like to end this presentation with an example here of where tagging might actually be useful. So this is an article from PubMed, Measuring Access to Primary Medical Care, Some Examples of the Use of Geographical Information Systems. So this is a great title. Even though it's a few years old now, this article is probably still quite interesting and relevant. GIS is still very popular and is actually catching on even more. Just take a look at Google Maps and all the different mashups people have made on top of it. Try going to a site now and looking for their travel directions, and odds are it's on a Google map. The interesting thing though is, and this is something I'll explain in just a second, you can search through these mesh terms all you want and you will not find a term that says GIS anywhere in that list. Anybody think of a reason why it might not be there? Because it seems like it'd be a significant term.
It's not in the vocabulary.
It is.
It is?
The term wasn't added until 2000.
Gastrointestinal.
No, the term is actually Geographic Information Systems, but the term wasn't added till the PubMed mesh headings until 2003. This article was published in 1998.
Oh,
Yeah.
So the term did not exist then, and therefore it was not used to index this article, and nobody has gone back and added this term, even though it might be useful. Technically, you don't need to have that term because it's in the title, but a lot of systems actually use subject headings, titles, and in combinations and things from the abstract in order to boost the relevance of an article. So the more times it appears in the record, the better, actually. So this is what is listed for this article on Site You Like, which is a social bookmarking site for academic articles. You can see the term GIS here in geography. Obviously this person wasn't as interested in the medical aspect, but then the medical aspect is pretty well covered over here. And you can see this term was added in 2003, Geographic Information Systems. Now there's a problem with this term. It's an acronym. You know, a lot of people know GIS stands for Geographic Information Systems, but when we're looking at health, do we know that they don't have a term that actually matches to GIS as well? Yes. You know, so this is not as useful a term, but you could expand this using the term geography, making the match to this, and then it would be extremely useful as an add-on. So I'll just leave you with that as a thought. You know, you can see the combination of these terms actually do a better job of describing the article than just the one instead of indexing. So that's the presentation.
I have a question. When you get down in the WebMD from the the very common terms to those out along the tail, is it because people are using terms that are very specific to maybe a condition they're looking up or some, are they real specific terms that I'm looking up some obscure disease that most people don't care? Is that what happens? Is that what makes them unique?
Some of them are very obscure terms, but you also get things like My Health. The other day in class, we were looking at a random bookmark on Delicious, and somebody had tagged it with My Unique Tag. You get unusual things like that. Some people will tag with the date they tagged it.
Oh, okay. So not necessarily.
So yes, those terms you mentioned are some of what you're seeing in the long tail, but some of the other stuff is different. To read, that's one of the most popular tags everywhere, actually. To do, very popular as well.
Okay. Oh, thank you.
How are the suggested tags determined? How are they suggested?
Well, I don't know exactly. I don't work for Delicious, but
So is it like the top 10 tags used for this particular website? Or?
it is something like that, yeah. Usually they display the top 25 along the side,
Okay.
and that seems to be where they're pulling these things out. But they'll also give you a list of tags you've used that match what other people assigned to that site as well.
Okay.
So I'm not absolutely sure what algorithm they're using, but it seems to be top 25.
Because if it's random, you may hit on something that doesn't have any popularity at all.
No.
It really has to be relevance, I think. That
They're definitely using popularity to select the tags that they recommend for you. I just don't know exactly which ones they're selecting, or whether they have a process of weeding out things like to read. because that's often very popular.
My unique tag.
Yes. I don't think that one's very popular, but I just
I'm
thought
gonna start using that for every website.
I just saw that last week. That would be
Keep
good.
watching your data.
Yeah.
Well, the other thing is when Dietmar and I were doing a project, there's spam in there as well. And we were looking for things that had a certain number of postings, and we found there were a whole bunch of them that had 36 postings each, and they were all for things that was spam.
Yeah, but that data set has other problems. That's the site you like, which is academic articles. I've been working with that too, and one of the problems is people have bookmarked the wrong URL. So you know how if there's nothing in the window, sometimes you get about link. So people bookmarked that, but added reference information for the article, and then these all get crunched together. So you get hundreds of articles all stuck together as if they're all the same article, because they all have the same URL about blank, which is obviously a mistake. Just you just hit the bookmark or wherever when you were on the wrong screen, and then you probably wondered why I didn't pick up the data properly. I do that. This site you like is supposed to pick up at least some of the reference information from the article for you, which is really convenient. There's a lot of problems with that data set. Any other questions? Yeah.
What's the relation between tags and SEO? I mean, is it possible that people, for instance, posting in a medical website, they use the tag help even if it's redundant because they want to improve the page rank of that website, of that post?
Well, there are two possible problems there. One of them is spam, where people are actually deliberately, where people are paying people to inflate the rank of their website that way.
But I mean, for instance, does page rank count tags in their ranking?
As far as I know, they're not using it. They're still using a variation on their citation algorithm that they were using in the first place. But I'm not sure. Wikipedia shows up a lot higher than Delicious most of the time. So I don't think they're using tags specifically.
Maybe that's the motivation of taggers in Gutenberg when they tag ebook, even if it's redundant, because they want to position it.
But is it redundant? I mean, if you're thinking about things tagged on PubMed, using a term like health might well be redundant, and you probably wouldn't use it that often, at least not by itself. But if you're tagging on a global site where everything is there, then health isn't redundant. It's actually really important.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I don't know whether Google's using these terms or not. I mean, Yahoo bought Delicious, not Google. So.
And I have another question. Is it possible to identify taggers according to their profile? I mean, in different websites, just identifying the same email address or
you can identify me.
similarities?
I use the same username for all of them.
Yeah, or maybe try to guess by similarities.
I haven't looked at that. But if people use the same username, sure, you can identify them. It's not that hard to figure out the URL for a user profile, and then you just change the username. But like I said, you can find me. I'm using the same username. I haven't looked into that though, and I'm not sure whether you'd be able to identify enough people for it to be interesting. You can ask people, of course. If you do a survey, you can ask people to provide their usernames for all the sites.
Do you think it would be interesting to take some
I don't know.